This is All India Radio. Ruskin Bond was born in Kasauli, Himachal Pradesh in 1934. In the course of a writing career spanning 35 years, he has written over 100 short stories, essays, novels, and more than 30 books for children. His stories are predominantly set in the beautiful hill country of Garhwal, where he has made his home. Ruskin Bond's stories are rewarding for their compassionate portrayal of love, loss, accomplishment, pain, and struggle. We now bring a recording of an interview with Ruskin Bond. He is being interviewed by Sri Ganesh Saili.
Mr. Ruskin Bond,
Yes, Mr. Seli.
how old were you when you started writing? And what made you want to become a writer?
Well, I started writing when I was still at school. And I think part of the reason for wanting to become a writer was the fact that I was a great lover of books, a great reader, a great bookworm as a boy. And I think I wanted to emulate other great writers. Also, when I was very small, my father had given me an interest in books and had even taught me to keep a diary. So as I went through school and I found I was, in fact, a good essay writer and usually excelled in that department, the ambition to write grew in me, so that by the time I finished school, I was quite determined to be a writer and nothing else, with the result that I didn't even go to college. Straight after school, I began writing, and at the age of 17, I wrote my first novel, which was actually published a year later in England. And so after that, I never looked back. But it was never easy. You asked me if I had instant success or if there were difficulties. And there always were and still are difficulties, because the life of a freelance is never smooth. Unless you're very lucky and you write a bestseller or several bestsellers. So over the years, it's been at the same time very satisfying to know that all the hard work I put in 30 years ago or more is now beginning to bring me some reward.
Ruskin, most of your stories are set in Mussoorie and the Doon Valley. What made you choose this area or background to write about?
Well, these are the areas I know best, and I think every writer should write about the places he knows really well. Dehradun I knew as a child and a boy. I grew up there. I had grandparents there, and as a boy I had many friends there. Mussoorie I've lived in for the last 30 years. So you could say half my life or more than half my life has been spent in the valley and in these mountains. So it's natural that my inspiration also comes from the same area. And the people I've met, some of them have become even characters in my stories. And or I've written about my childhood to a great extent. And I'm still, in fact, writing about these surroundings.
What other writers, Ruskin, have influenced your style, your writing?
Well, I think we are most influenced by writers who meant something to us when we were very young. So that when one sets out, and when I started out writing, I was perhaps to some extent influenced by the writers I loved most. It might have been Dickens. At school, I was fond of David Copperfield. In fact, I wanted to emulate him. David Copperfield runs away from home and grows up to be a writer, and I did much the same thing. Then I enjoyed reading humorous writers. I enjoyed reading Tagore and those early English translations. I read, in fact, whatever I could lay hands on, and I think sometimes we are influenced by writers without even realizing it or without knowing quite where those influences come from. But then a lot has to be original and come from yourself, from your own individual psyche or personality, and from the environment in which you grew up.
Do you prefer the short story or the novel? What is your favorite medium? What about poetry?
Personally, I prefer writing the short story. I always have, because it's something where I can perhaps in a few pages catch a fleeting moment, an incident, a particular character. Whereas a novel is really you're covering people over a long period of time, and perhaps you need a different kind of nature to write the novel. I've written a couple of short novels, but I must say I enjoy myself more writing the short story. And poetry too, I'm very fond of writing poetry, though perhaps my poems are not very well known. I usually start off with a great flourish, and when I come to the last line, it sort of fizzles out. So I leave a lot of my poems unpublished for that reason.
What made you start writing for children?
Yes. Well, I actually started writing for children when I was about 40. Now, when I first became a writer, and when I was 17, 18, that time I wanted to write exclusively for adults. We take ourselves more seriously when we're young. So I really never thought of writing for children till I was about halfway through my writing career. And then what really happened was, I think I'd written a sort of a novel which wasn't long enough for an adult novel, nor was it short enough to be a short story. And then one of my publishing friends said, "This would make a very good children's book, Ruskin. Why don't you just edit it a bit, shorten it, change it around a bit?" And I did that, and it was my first children's book called Angry River, and it was a great success abroad and in India, and it's still in print. And I followed that up with a number of others, so that I've written 30 to 40 books for children. In the case of my children's books, well, my children's books go into two categories, really. One is the autobiographical, in where I write about my own childhood and those who I knew as a child, and sometimes these are humorous accounts. And other, perhaps maybe in a way more serious books, are those where I write about other children, children I've known and seen around me, and I try to describe their lives and their problems. And if it's say a village in the hills or down in the plains, and the conditions in which they live. So it's really realistic writing. I'm not writing fairy tales. And I try to show children in situations which bring out in their more positive qualities, whether it's a courage or a certain presence of mind, or the endurance or the pertinacity to continue to achieve something, to do what they want to do.
There's a strong element of nature and environment in your writings, a streak, going back quite some time. You were writing about it before it even became fashionable. Can you tell us how, Bond?
Well, I think it's always been there in my writing, but perhaps more so in the last 20 years. Perhaps I think the strong emphasis on nature, in both as theme and background to my writing, perhaps came into it when I came here to live in the hills and in the mountains, because up here one is much closer to nature, and closer to the forest, to wildlife, to flowers and birds and every aspect of nature. Whereas otherwise, living in towns or cities, you are not that close. You might have a beautiful garden, but it's not the same thing.
How did you choose Mussoorie as a place to live in?
Well, it's quite simple, really, Ganesh, because I, I belong to the area. I grew up in Dehra. My grandparents were there and my friends. So when back in the 60s, I was living and working in Delhi, and I got quite fed up of it. I said, I'm just going to now freelance completely, and to do that, I must go and live in the hills. And so I chose Mussoorie because I knew it, because I knew also Dehradun well. I felt at home. It wasn't as though I had to, come to a strange place and start life anew. I was really going back in a way to my childhood. So it was, I think, just a natural choice, not because Mussoorie was more beautiful than Simla or Nainital or Darjeeling, but because it was where I belonged.
And what do you feel about other Indian writers writing in English?
Well, in the last few years, a great many new writers have come into prominence. If you go back to the time I started writing, there were only about 4 or 5 who were well known, like Mulk Rajanand and R.K. Narayan and others who actually had to publish abroad. Now the phenomenon of new writers coming up in India is partly due to the fact that publishing has come of age in India.
What a role does a writer have, in where society today, as we see it?
Well, sometimes it's a conscious role and sometimes it's a subconscious role. I don't set out to preach or tell people how to live or be better citizens. So if through my stories I can give people just the reading habit or even the pleasure of reading, and then if they find something in my work that appeals to them, their minds, their hearts, and they feel there's something beautiful there, I feel I might have achieved something.
Tell us, Ruskin, is there a message you're trying to convey in your writing?
Well, no particular message, but I try to bring out perhaps what is best in human nature, rather than, I think a lot of modern writers perhaps today present what is negative or what is worst in human nature. But I always try to look for some redeeming factor. And so if there is a message, it is that there's still hope for humanity.
What is your next book about?
I'm not sure. If I talk about my next book, I'll never write it. but I've just finished a new children's book. Then starting a novel now, an adult novel. So sometimes I write for children, sometimes for adults, and sometimes for both.
That was an interview with eminent writer Ruskin Bond by Ganesh Saili. Came to you from the Bangalore station of All India Radio.